All right, here is our lesson 3.4 on unions, strikes, and the response of government and industry to those actions, covering these strikes and these particular unions here in this video. Being able to put these three things into maybe a T-chart for the left side on your notebook here on the unions, what they're about, goals, methods achieving the goals, and the strikes and the response to the strikes. This particular map shows a variety of a few of the strikes that are going on here in the late half of the 19th century, as well as counties in pink here that are showing a significant amount of strike and labor unrest in them. Keep in mind that this is the time period 1870 to 1890, and remember this is also the time period in which we have two Great Depressions, the Panic of 1873 as well as the Panic of 1893. And so when we have these economic conditions get really tough and people lose their jobs, we have people demanding more and putting pressure on business and industry to do something, and government to do something about it as well. But do they do so? That's the issue, and that's the key question to recognize here. 1866, one of our first most notable unions is the National Labor Union, led by and founded by William Silvis. It's one of the first national unions to try to unify people of a variety of different backgrounds, skilled or unskilled, farmers, into one big force of people to apply pressure to industry and to business. But they were not so interested in anybody else other than white men and anybody who is of a foreign nationality not included in that union. And this is going to be one of the weaknesses of the unions and one of the main themes of unions, in that they're not necessarily so keen on outsiders. They're going to be very anti-immigrant. They did support cooperatives, which were a big thing of the Grange, if you remember, basically setting up a store of merchants, a store for common people and for consumers at the lowest price possible, so that there's no price gouging going on here. They were involved with that. So a similarity with the Grangers and the Grange movement, and eventually that's going to help them come together in later political movements like the Progressive era. And they are politically active here, but they're all about trying to maintain jobs for Americans, not foreigners. The Chinese Exclusion Act, we'll talk about a little bit later, is one of the key acts that tried to ban immigration from China, and they are very active in that. All right. One of the great strikes of the 1870s is the Great Railroad Strike, kind of promoted and fostered by the American Railway Union, and it was kind of triggered also by, in the middle of this Great Panic of 1873, lots of railroad workers having their wages cut several times over and over. Finally, the workers walk out, and they block the railroad tracks. They set fire to trains, as you see here in the picture. Lots of damage. Massive numbers of workers, 80,000 total, basically don't go to work, and the economic system of the country, the backbone of the country, the railroads, shut down. And the result of this is, of course, a significant amount of violence and property destroyed, but the government in the states send out militias. In fact, it'd be important to kind of note here that the National Guards, as we kind of know it, are going to be starting to get formed here after a period of these strikes kind of start to happen, and that's the intent of the state militias, to try and prevent this unrest that's developing here late into the 19th century. President Hayes declares it a rebellion, sends in federal troops. Response, there's 100+ people who die in all this, millions of dollars in lost property and destruction. All right. The Knights of Labor kind of takes over after the National Labor Union in 1869, and they have this goal also that is centered around the idea of one big union, bring everybody in as much as possible. They do include African Americans, they do include immigrants, unskilled workers, skilled workers, women. Very, very progressive for the time period. This would probably be one of the most important unions to know for this time period. And the goal is to basically come up with an 8-hour workday. Equal pay for equal work is a big, very progressive thing. Get rid of child labor. Worker-owned factories, kind of a socialist kind of ideology here, promoted by and founder here, Terence Powderly. They were very opposed to strikes because it would lead to violence. It would give a negative label on them, and that is exactly what happens with the Knights of Labor, in that some violent strikes bring about their demise. Here's a nice poster and postcard for what most unions were about, but this particular union, the Knights of Labor, really pushed the 8-8-8 theme. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will, whatever we want to do. The 1886 Haymarket Square riot is the one big event and big violent riot here that kind of helps bring down the Knights of Labor and puts a bad public label on them. There is a worker protest and strike that's going on centering around the McCormick Harvester Company factory that's building lots of farm equipment in Chicago, and somebody throws a bomb into a crowd. Workers are killed during the protest, but in the bomb blast, a police officer is killed, amongst others, and we have Americans associating, especially with this particular event, but others as well, that these labor unions and labor movements are all about terrorism and disorder and unrest, especially since this bomb blast is blamed on an anarchist group. And now, if you don't know what anarchism means, it basically means that it's a philosophy and belief in no government is a good government. And no government is a good government. Government is bad. There should be no government. And many of these anarchists were very well organized. There's an anarchist organization organized in Chicago and other places, but especially in Chicago, they tended to be immigrants from Bohemia and Germany at the time. And so this anarchism gets associated with foreigners and immigration as well. That's going to be the rise of nativism we'll talk about in the next lesson here coming up. This also results in some trials and executions. 7 anarchists were rounded up and brought to jail and trial for this particular death of a police officer here that you see, and the executions that are ensue here with this spark a great amount of protest amongst laborers and workers throughout not only the United States, but it becomes kind of an internationally advertised and media expressed kind of a trial. And these particular 8 individuals kind of become martyrs for the labor union, labor movement at this point in time. And so this movement is so strong and intent on trying to get reform and change that they actually do get it to happen. In particular, some states, Oregon being the first, start recognizing May Day or a day as a day of as a legal holiday to stop work and basically recognize that the rights and the interests of common workers. And eventually in 1894, we have it becoming a national holiday, the 1st of September, now known as Labor Day. Instead of May Day, now it's Labor Day. But it is dedicated to the achievements of American workers and their plight and their efforts to try and gain some sort of equal footing in the economic system and fair treatment in the economic system. Part of this probably was a way of trying to placate and to satisfy the labor movement and to try to prevent it from getting any more radical than it already was. 1894, the first year of our 1893 Great Panic. But it's still here with us today, and it stems out of that Haymarket Square riot. And it also kind of, again, becomes kind of an international movement where there is a movement to try and bring everybody in the world that's a common work together to put force on the powers that be to try and force change. And that's a very, very threatening thing. So this whole labor union movement is scary because of the violence that it gets associated with. And as we mentioned before in class, this is something that gets associated with communism and socialism. All right, and so that, of course, is very anti-capitalism, anti-free enterprise, threatening to private property, threatening to democracy, freedom, free rights, all that kind of thing, laissez-faire, all that kind of thing. 1886, we have the American Federation of Labor developing. The Knights of Labor kind of die off because of that whole Haymarket Square riot kind of a thing. And this one becomes even bigger, but it's mostly for skilled craft union type workers, and they also focused on using strikes and stayed to using strikes and weren't on the more peaceful arbitration side of things so much, but they grew by 1904 to about 1.5 million plus workers and members. They said, we'll use strikes, but we'll also make sure that we extend a peaceful hand and promote peaceful bargaining, collective bargaining. Workers, right, factory owners, both sides getting together and trying to come up with some sort of an agreement and a process to discuss, propose, bargain, and settle on something that's good for the interests of both parties in this. And so this is what they're all trying to do, although not all states allow for this to happen. Collective bargaining was actually prevented and by law banned. So this is something they're working for. But other strategies that the AFL uses, as well as some other labor unions, is one thing called closed shop that basically said that if you're going to work in this factory, you have to be a member of the union. It's closed to all non-union members. Therefore, the union and its existence will always be around and be there to pressure for better work conditions, better wages, shorter hours for the workers. They'll walk out if they don't think that they're being treated properly, to shut the factory down and put economic pressure on the owners. Boycotts of goods was a very popular thing as well. Encourage people not to go buy the product that the company is making in particular, was something that they used on that union side and with that union's methodology. One of the more violent strikes, and this is tied to Mr. Andrew Carnegie of the Steel Mill Company of Pennsylvania, is the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania, which is, Homestead was the center, the home base for Carnegie Steel. And the factory managers basically hired non-union workers when these particular individuals go on strike for better wages and such, and they also bring with them 300 armed guards, Pinkertons, by the way, private investigators now armed to defend the interests of Carnegie Steel. And it leads to violence, basically literally a war. Some small cannons were utilized. The state militia comes in to try and put down the violence and settle things. And ultimately it fails, and the plant is reopened with non-union workers. But this puts on a significant a blot on Andrew Carnegie, and puts pressure on him to change things, and ultimately leads to him selling his company after that. And people greatly criticize him for being very inhuman and a robber baron kind of an individual out of how he dealt with all of that, not in the interest of workers. Another very violent strike is the Pullman Railroad Car Company. And this Pullman Railroad Car Company made the railroad cars for passengers, plush, cushy chairs and seats and food service and that kind of thing. And the workers had gone on strike. The rest of the year, 1894, the workers go on strike for better wages. It's 1 year after the start of the Panic of 1893. And when the workers went on strike, Pullman closed the plant. It does significantly disrupt railroad traffic throughout the country. That's a big thing with our railroad strikes and these things getting shut down. It's an economic threat to everybody, whether you're a railroad worker or a company owner or not, because everybody utilizes that thing. Even farmers get disrupted with that. And the American Railway Union, which was behind it, supported that strike and encouraged that strike by saying we're not going to handle or hook up railroad cars made by the Pullman Railroad Car Company. And so we have this massive strike. And the key guy that's really important here, we're going to bring him about again several times, he's going to run for president in the future, is Eugene V. Debs, who kind of led that strike with the American Railway Union. And this leads to a significant amount of railroad traffic being disrupted in the country. And it's responded to very strongly here. We see Pullman kind of squeezing the workers. Rent is very high, but their late wages get squeezed down lower and lower and lower, turning the screw here. Pressure on the workers all the time. High rent, pressure from both sides, top and bottom. This is a very violent incident here, and again, with this violence and destruction of railroad company property that just can't be had, the U.S. Attorney General issues a court order, also known as an injunction, to end the strike, which basically says if you don't stop, then we're coming after you, putting you in a jail. We're doing this because not only is it holding up trade of goods and buying and selling things, but the U.S. mail gets moved around on the railroad system, and that cannot be held up. You don't mess with the mailman and the post office and mail. And so Eugene V. Debs is putting him in jail because he refused to end the strike, and the president comes in and brings in federal troops to shut that strike down as well. There again is another response. And so a strong pattern there with of industry and government response to what is going on here with union methods and goals and strikes and such. And a nice little left side chart for you would maybe look like this, and identifying simply what some of those goals were by union, or in generally what unions were trying to achieve, and then some of the methods, and then some of the responses of government and industry. See you next time.